too many people now, I think because of some failures in the school system, which is probably a different topic we should talk about. But in any event, I think we are creating a generation of people with very, very fragile personalities. Some adversity comes and they run to a safe room and hide.
This is the truth with John Gordon. Assaulting the narrative. Destroying the lie. Unearthing the truth.
I want the truth!
This is the truth with John Gordon.
Today we are honored to have the former Secretary of Commerce under the Trump administration, the Honorable Wilbur Ross is our guest today. Secretary Ross, welcome to The Truth.
Thank you for having me on, John.
It is an honor and a privilege to be in your midst as always. Tell us a little bit about, I read your bio, and if I were to read your bio, there would be no time left for the interview. So I'm going to skip reading it, but invite you to tell us about your early life. You have lived the American dream as well as anyone I know. Tell us about your beginnings.
Well, grew up in a little town in New Jersey called North Bergen, halfway between the Lincoln Tunnel and the George Washington Bridge. My father was a local lawyer, local elected official, and my mother was a third grade school teacher at the public school that I attended.
Well, in those days, being a public school teacher was a real position of esteem and a real service. I remember every teacher I ever had, mostly fondly.
Well, in those days, it was interesting. The union dues, the teachers were unionized just as they are now. But in those days, most of the dues went for their pension fund. Over the years, the union has offloaded the pensions onto the localities and the states. So now a very, very large portion of the dues goes for politics.
So you grew up in a small town in New Jersey. Your parents, you were privileged to have two loving parents,
right,
good role models. And then that took you to Yale for your undergraduate degree, and then
yes,
you went to Harvard and got an MBA.
Yes, correct.
And so how did you launch your career after that? Because I've noted that you have been recognized as one of the 50 most influential people in finance globally in the world. So how did you, you had a great foundation to spring from, but how did you enter your business career, and what was the big break for you?
Well, I had been ROTC at Yale, and I got deferral to go to business school. Then I had to go serve in the Army as an officer. And that got me extended from 6 months to 18 months because it was the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the employer, a very go-go money manager called Emery DeVay, that had hired me out of school, let me have the deferral. But then 1 week before I was scheduled to join him, died, and on his deathbed sold the firm to Robert Winthrop from the Massachusetts family, who had been a very good client. So I changed jobs before I even got there, at least the titular. Winthrop decided after some sessions with our clients that he liked better being a client than being a manager. So he sold the firm to Wood Struthers and Winthrop. So now in my first month, I changed jobs. The second time, didn't even change my seat, but changed jobs again. And that turned out to be a great break. One of the things that we had at DeVay was a venture capital fund. Wood Struthers, a very conservative firm, didn't want that. So they fired the people and made me an officer of it And my task for the next 2 years was to get them out of the fund. So some of the companies were very good, and we sold them for a big price. A lot of them needed workout, and that's where I first learned a little bit about how you do distress workouts. So it was a horrible beginning in that it was kind of frightening to have all that change in the beginning, but it turned out to be a very good launching pad.
So for our audience, you were instrumental in the reorganization and the restructuring of Pan Am, TWA, Texaco.
Right.
These are some big names and iconic names in
Yes.
American business.
Yes.
What a
Yes.
phenomenal career.
Well,
So the thing that as I was reading about your experiences, you took on some very big risk. I mean, if I understand it correctly, you would identify a company that was in trouble, and then you would go and buy a controlling interest, or maybe all of it, I'm not sure,
no.
and then turn the company around.
Yes, that was the latter phase. In the early phase, I was simply advising participants in the bankruptcy.
I see.
Because what had happened in the 70s and very early 80s, Mike Milken invented the idea of creating deliberately high risk, high yield bonds. And I could figure out that that was definitely going to lead to more bankruptcies. So started organizing institutional investors to deal with that problem as a group rather than let themselves get picked off one by one.
But the question that kept coming back to my mind was that when you talk about restructuring business companies as large as these, they have some really smart people working there.
Sure.
How could you develop a vision that would make this company sustainable when the current management was unable to do so?
Well, as companies have protracted problems, they generally develop what I would call a loser's mentality. And when you go talk to them about, well, what's the nature of your problems, they always point to some external factor. Class action litigants, the union, the Chinese, whatever, rather than focusing on what they can fix, what's within their own domain. So that's one thing, is simply changing the attitude and looking at it with new eyes. The second thing, most of the times when people go bad, it's because they overexpanded using debt as the financing. Once that has crystallized and made them a bankrupt company, very hard for them to admit that that big decision was really grievously wrong and has to be reversed. So often it's more a question of peeling away bits of the onion that never should have been there, and getting back to an original core. Now, not every business is fixable, but an awful lot of them are.
Did you ever buy any that you determined were not fixable? Did you take
Yes,
a bath?
some had to liquidate. Drexel Burnham itself was not fixable. Financial service companies are very, very fragile businesses because they totally depend on investors being confident in them. So when Drexel went bad as a result of too many defaults in its junk bond portfolio, it was pretty clear it would have to be liquidated. Problem was, most of the securities that were in its multi-billion-dollar portfolio were securities where it was the main market maker. So now you no longer had the principal market maker, and that had very bad implications for the values. So we had to figure out a way to keep an entity alive for long enough to let the bonds work out and find a decent level. So once in a while, as in the Drexel case, they're just not fixable.
So what was your crowning achievement? What was the best, when you look back over your career, what are you most proud of in terms of
Well,
financial result?
the best deal was when I bought the business I had founded from Rothschild. I worked for the Rothschild family for over 25 years. And that's where I did most of the restructuring advisory work. I was in charge of global restructurings for the Rothschild Group. So in the latter part of the 25 years, decided also to start a fund called the Rothschild Recovery Fund, which would invest in distressed companies, mostly in ones that we were not wanting to be the advisor, because you couldn't be both the advisor and an investor. That would be conflicts. So anyhow, so we started this fund in 1997, and by early 2000, for a lot of reasons, I decided I didn't want to keep doing both the advisory work and the investing, that I preferred the investing. So I arranged to buy the business from Rothschild. I had already owned a third of it, my team owned a third, and they owned a third. So it was really just buying out their third. And that was a launch as an entrepreneur at age 63.
Amazing.
Which was around when most people are getting ready to retire. But this was the opposite of retirement. So the entire team joined me. We obviously had to change the name. We couldn't use the Rothschild name. So I modestly called it W.L. Ross & Co. And the funds were called WLR Recovery this, WLR Recovery that. And over the years, we about every 18 months would raise a new fund. And eventually in 2006, I sold the business to Invesco, a $1 trillion money manager that had not been very much in alternative investments. So they wanted to broaden their horizon of products that they offered to their clients.
So at W.L. Ross, what was your crowning achievement? What business did you buy and turn around and that you were?
The ones that I think we had the most success with, first of all, was the steel industry. Bought Bethlehem Steel and a bunch of others. And we created by far the lowest cost American producer. We took the number of man hours to make a ton of steel down from 6 to 1.5. So you can imagine how that transformed
Amazing.
the income statement. The other thing
And did you
was,
know that going into it? Was that your plan all
oh
along?
yeah, it was what happened. The steel industry is a very cyclical business and was then, just as happened again later, very vulnerable to China. China has had chronic overcapacity in the metals and invariably uses the export markets to absorb its excess. Well, China's excess in those days was equal to the total steel production in the U.S., 100 million tons. So it was a huge complicating factor. But meanwhile, because wages are so low in China and because there was such feather bedding in the union contract, I called Leo Gerard, who was the head of the United Steelworkers, and said, Leo, these companies are operating within weeks or months of being liquidated, and I'm willing to take them on, put in some new capital, but we need a non-conforming contract, namely a contract we'll leave the wages the same. That's not anything I'm going to fuss with, because you fuss with wages, you create morale problems. So what we did do was do away with some of the work rules. They had very, very restrictive work rule. It was practically, you can only pick up a red shovel, and this other fellow can only pick up a white shovel. I mean, they were pretty extreme. So we did away with those, and we did away with many of the job classifications. Job classification, it means that's all you can have the fellow do. You can't have him do a task that's not detailed within the job classification. So what did that mean? Steelmaking equipment is very huge in size, can be $500 million for one machine, and can be a mile and a half long. So big, heavy equipment. And it usually doesn't need to be repaired because it's well built, but the maintainers and the operators each knew how to do the other's job. However, they weren't permitted to. So for months, the maintainers would sit around playing pinochle, and then the equipment would go out, and then the operators would start playing pinochle while the maintainers fixed it. So we did away with that. And altogether, we took 32 job classifications down to 5.
Wow.
So there were only 5 different categories of workers. And we excluded from the union the people who had nothing to do with steel, the back office people, people like that, who were essential jobs, but they didn't have to be steel workers with the steel worker contract. So it worked out very, very well.
So how many companies did you purchase and put
About
into
5 altogether.
International Steel Group?
We did LTV, we did Wheeling, Pittsburgh, we did Acme, we did Bethlehem. So we did quite a few. Bethlehem was the big one. And
for how many years did you then operate these companies?
operated that for about 3 years, and then merged it into Mattel Steel. Lakshmi Mattel had done in overseas markets pretty much what we had done in the U.S. market. And so we were both outsiders into the industry. Both had built big businesses. And we put the two together. Now we're the world's biggest steel company, except we had one missing link, which was Western Europe. So we then bought Arcelor, and that made ArcelorMittal, and then we were the main company.
So are you following AI and robotics?
Sure. Oh, absolutely.
And do you have a sense of what that might do to the labor market and to the global
Yes.
economy?
It reminds me of 19th century England when you had the Luddites. That was when the Brits were automating the textile industry. At that point, textiles were a gigantic industry in England. And the Luddites were afraid of losing their jobs. So they would go around to factories at night and destroy the equipment. Well, it turned out to be a wrong idea. The net effect of automation, the net effect of increasing productivity has always been it ultimately creates more jobs than are lost. The definition of the jobs is what changes. Think about it. When electronic data processing came in, people were afraid of the same thing. My God, there'll be no more clerical workers. Well, there are now more than there ever were. It's just now they do coding, they do other tasks. It's a different kind of labor, a higher intellectual value added. And I think that's what will be the ultimate outcome of AI.
So we're talking to Secretary Wilbur Ross, who is an American entrepreneur and business person. And he also served in President Trump's cabinet, which we're going to get to in just a moment. But he has authored a new book called Risk and Returns, Creating Success in Business and Life. So that is available on Amazon starting in August.
So it's available on Amazon right now.
But it
But it will be
be
delivered.
released. I have ordered my copy. And
Yeah, it'll be delivered September 10th.
So what advice would you have for young people starting out today? You know, this world is a lot different than the one I grew up in. And I have 3 sons, and I watch them as they're trying to get a foothold. And the traditional paths of going to work for a company, learning a craft, learning a skill set, and then building your career based on that seems to have, the model has changed. And I watch a lot of young men really struggling in getting their career going and launch. What if you were a young man today, how would you do it?
Well, I think several things. First of all, I think young people have to realize the only person who ultimately can hold them back in their career is themselves. And it's time to come out of the safe room, work hard, take a few risks, and try to turn hurdles into opportunities. Too many people now, I think because of some failures in the school system, which is probably a different topic we should talk about, but in any event, I think we are creating a generation of people with very, very fragile personalities. Some adversity comes and they run to a safe room and hide. That's not the way to do it.
I totally agree with you. I remember growing up as a kid, life was hard. And my dad served in World War II, and all of his relatives were farmers. And I just remember thinking that, all my relatives were farmers, and they were really tough guys, sweet guys, but tough guys. And my wife and I think to a fault, wanted to make life for our children easier than maybe we had it and our ancestors had it. I'm not sure it works. I don't think you can protect people from life.
No, you can't. And I think the other problem is we're not teaching kids the same fundamentals that we used to. When I was in public school and grammar school, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and history and geography, all those very fundamental things were the curriculum. There wasn't all this sociological experimentation. There wasn't a whole lot of stuff that has now come in. And as a result, it used to be the American educational system was a model for the whole world. Now, in many categories, we're 30th in the whole world. 30th. How can you be the number 1 country going forward if you're 30th in educational standing and fundamentals?
Well, I would predict that we won't be. And that leads us to the next chapter, and that is your life in public service.
Yeah.
How did you get the call?
Well, strangely, I started out life as a Democrat. My mother was a Democratic County Committee woman in New Jersey for, I guess, our whole adult life. And my father was a local elected official. So when I first started working in New York, I naturally gravitated toward Democratic politics. And in fact, when I was 29, I became the treasurer of the New York State Democratic Committee. So I was quite involved in the...
You were a credentialed Democrat.
Well, I don't know about credential.
You had a
Credentials
role.
are a tricky word nowadays.
So what changed your mind?
Well, over time, I think what really happened is the Democratic Party that existed then is not the Democratic Party that exists today. It's gotten off into a lot of directions that I totally disagree with. And principally, the direction that they had seemed to be taking is the solution to all problems is government. I don't feel that way. I feel instead that the cause of a lot of problems is actually government. So I think their whole bias toward only looking at governmental solutions is simply wrong.
So how did you get the call from President Trump to be Congress Secretary? What led you to that?
Well, one of the big bankruptcies that we did when I was doing the advisory side was the Trump Taj Mahal bankruptcy. Merrill Lynch and Bear Stearns had underwritten $800 million of bonds for the construction of the Taj Mahal in Atlantic City. Their client was Donald Trump. He was the main partner in the venture, and it had enormous cost overruns, and in fact never paid a coupon. As you know, in public bonds, coupons are payable every 6 months. Well, they never paid the first coupon, so the bondholders hired me to be their advisor to try to straighten this out and get them recovery. And so that's when I met Donald Trump. So it was under very adverse circumstances, but we developed a very healthy respect for each other. And interestingly, at the time, the biggest bondholder was Carl Icahn, and both Carl and I came out of it sufficiently impressed with Trump that we later supported him in his presidential candidacy. So it started from an adversarial position, became one of a degree of respect, and then active participation in his campaign. I wrote quite a few editorials during his campaign and had quite a few debates at left-wing think tanks, public debates with the other side. My big interest was in the commercial aspects of it, of government and of the economy. So that was what ultimately led them to select me.
So you were talking about paying the coupon on the bonds for the Taj Mahal. And as you were talking about that, the thought raced into my brain that I worry about our ability as a country to pay the coupon on U.S. treasuries. I had breakfast with the president of the Atlanta Federal Reserve a few years ago, and I asked him about the national debt, and my concern was that there seems to be no resolve to stop the absurd, out of control spending, then or now. And what he said to me was, don't worry, as long as the national debt does not exceed 75% of GDP, we'll be fine. And that was about 10 years ago. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the national debt today is like 113%
Yes.
of our GDP.
Right, it exceeds the GDP.
So you're a bankruptcy specialist. You're an economist. Are we in trouble? And when do we get to the tipping point?
Well, there's an old saying about bankruptcy. How long does it take bankruptcy to develop? And it goes very, very slowly at first, and then it happens all of a sudden. The key is no government actually ever really repays its debt. There's no government in the world. Almost every government operates at a deficit. And that's been true. I think anybody who describes himself or herself as being self-made is flattering themselves. Everybody has had help on the way up. It's a question of how do you get people to help you? How do you benefit from the knowledge that they have and the relationships that they have? But mostly in my case, it's been as you face obstacles, how do you overcome them and how do you turn them into opportunities? And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But that's the other thing. People have to understand that just because something didn't work out doesn't mean you're a failure. It just means you better learn something from it, go on to do something that works better the next time. And I think that resiliency is something that used to be very characteristic of the American persona, and I fear we've lost some of it. So as I said at the very beginning, I think people have to realize the only person who ultimately can keep you from success is yourself.
And on that note, thank you so much for coming on The Truth today.
Thank you, John.
It's been a complete pleasure and a
Good.
privilege.
Good to talk with you, John.
Thank you.